All right. We are tonight going to be in Luke 21, but as we get started, I'm going to back up just a little bit and read the end of chapter 20, because really these two episodes go together. It's one of those times when a chapter heading probably could have shifted a little bit, but that's okay. It doesn't compromise the power of the text. It just doesn't necessarily make it as smooth of a read as it might have been originally. So I'd like to just go ahead and read this and then make a few observations about what we're seeing here. And Tyler, you and Jana may want to back up some. Somebody else in the class may want to back up some and review from last week once we have these introductory thoughts, or we can just go right into the next section. It's whatever you guys would like to do. So I'm just going to start reading in verse 45 of chapter 20. It's a pretty short section, and then we'll go forward from there. While all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury, and he also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. "And truly I tell you," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on." There's a whole lot going on right here. I just want to make a few observations, and I would love to hear from others as well tonight. This is a story that, for those of us who grew up in church, we heard this text a lot. There's a depth here that just kind of a casual reading, it's pretty easy to miss, I think, because there's so many things going on. There's all kinds of Old Testament tie-ins. There is a lot of imagery. There is a lot of role reversal. There's a lot of opposites, and all of that is just kind of rolled into one. And then Jesus uses this teaching in this episode, this warning in this episode, then to set up what happens next, which Tyler will go into here just a little bit, as Jesus prophesies about the destruction of the temple, and not just the temple, but much more than that. So as I was reading through this section, I tried to go back and look at how important it was to honor widows. And if you have a copy of the handout that I sent out with the notes today, I'm not going to read that to you, but it's pretty fascinating. And really what I put in there, I wouldn't say it scratches the surface, because it's much more than that. The verses that I pulled and quoted, particularly from Exodus and from Deuteronomy, speak very, very strongly about what Israel's responsibility was to widows, and also what would happen to those who did not care for them or who disenfranchised them. And so Jesus, in what he is doing here as Messiah, as Lord, as Son of Man, either we see that directly quoted in the text or we see it inferred in the text based on his actions. What he is doing here is continuing the work of his Father, continuing the justice of his Father, continuing the rescue and the heart of his Father that God laid down many, many years ago when he was in covenant with his people. So there's congruence here with what Jesus is saying and what God has assured is going to happen. And if we look in the Old Testament particularly, there is language of someone being cursed. In Deuteronomy 27, there's multiple curses that are listed for people who do certain things to others. And one of the curses that's pointed out in that passage is a curse on those who withhold justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. And so God's nature, as we see in Deuteronomy 10:18, he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow. And so these who were putting their trust in brick and mortar, the beauty of the temple, the grandeur of the temple, the status that perhaps they were afforded, they had just totally missed the mark. And so there is really a double condemnation here. In the latter part of chapter 20, we saw that they were taking the houses, and now we see that in some ways they're taking even her last coins, and not that they're not, it's not that they're taking it or robbing her, but they're not helping her, they're not giving and caring for. And so it's just a fascinating scene that's going on, and also that Jesus obviously cares very, very deeply, not just for this woman, but for the widows, the fatherless, etc. So one of the things that I wanted to put out there, and then I'll stop and just see if anybody wants to make any observations about this opening piece, and then we can back up if we need to. But if we go back and we look in Genesis 38 and Deuteronomy 24, there are at least two examples there of widows and their attire. I tried to do a pretty extensive search on this, and I really couldn't find anything. And so I was hoping that maybe Tyler or Jana had come across something in their studies that would have actually identified a widow. Some scholars say that they could have been identified. Of course, there was particularly in the mourning period, there probably was a particular color that they would wear. In some cultures, we see that, even in recent years, like an armband, a black armband, or a specific color, a head covering perhaps that is dark, or even an entire ensemble that is a particular color. But some scholars also said that it was easy to spot widows just because so many of them were just so phenomenally poor. And so just very worn clothes, very, very harsh, difficult lifestyles. And so not sure at this particular point in history, because obviously we're pretty far removed from those references, not sure at this particular point in history what would have identified a widow. But as I said, you guys may have more insight on that than I do, and would love to hear your thoughts. So as an introduction, I want to stop there for just a second and see if anybody has a comment, and then if not, Tyler, Jana, feel free to weigh in, and then we'll go from there.
Craig, I've done a few blogs on the widow, and one thing I noted in one of them was that Jesus validated the widow that day, and that I in my blog validated her. So if she did not feel worthy that day, you hope that the disciples went up to her and told her how much he validated her that day. And I noted how I validated her in my blog. She deserved more than she got, and it's like she was noticed by him that day. And I also talked about in another blog about how I used to people watch, but Jesus always heart watched, and that if we heart watched more, it would be a totally different world we live in.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that, Jana Lisa. I love that. Love that. And there's so much contrast.
I'd like to repeat that.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
I'd like to repeat that as well. I mean, it's a continuing theme of Jesus' teaching, especially in these few instances here. It's not about your money. It's not about your position. It's about your heart.
Yeah.
And as I studied the Old Testament over the recent years, the daily Bible reading, the Israelites went into exile for two reasons. One was idolatry.
Mm,
Other was failure to take care of the poor.
mm,
Those same two are mentioned in almost every prophecy.
wow.
One of them is in Isaiah and almost all the minor prophets.
Mm,
Those same two things are mentioned. In one case, one person is castigated for taking the widow's robe in trust for a loan.
mm,
It was against the Levitical law to start with, to loan
yeah.
to the widow. You're supposed to give, and certainly not take her robe in trust, because the prophet then says, how will she stay warm at night?
Right.
Now that's poor. If that's all you have, that's poor.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
But
so true.
but I would also have to mention that we don't realize our richness, because for the majority of Americans to the beginning of the 20th century, if you had one set of clothes, you were average.
Yeah.
It was the rich who had more than one set.
Right. Right. Yeah. That's really good insight. Thank you for sharing that. Roy also is weighing in via chat and mentioned it's extremely offensive to God not to take care of the poor, and they were not taking care of the poor, the widows, with no love for people. It's really an interesting contrast here too, and this is where some of the and we see this in Luke, as we said from the very, very beginning, we see it all the time. You know, you have the grandeur of the temple, and just prior to this, how in awe everyone was of the temple. And Tyler, you guys may want to say more about this. You've actually been on the site, you know, where some of this archaeology exists. But you know, even by today's standards, I think it would have been an extremely impressive sight to behold. But then we compare that with this woman who, you know, grandeur would be the last thing probably that would come to your mind. Greatness would probably be the last thing that comes to your mind. And yet Jesus reverses this, and ultimately the temple is brought to dust, and this widow, as a valued member of the kingdom of God, would be exalted as child of God. And so that's just one example of some of the reversal that we see here. But anyway, I appreciate those thoughts. Tyler, Jana, feel free to weigh in and just kind of share what you think, and go ahead then whenever you're ready and transition us into the next piece.
The temple is kind of the Temple Mount, specifically what Herod built, and that's kind of the problem in Jesus' day, is that, you know, this big beautiful, well, actually the temple wasn't really technically finished until like right before it was destroyed, which is kind of funny. Like they lay the last brick and then the Romans come in and destroy it all, which is kind of comical, but not funny. But it's funny because Herod built it, is why it's funny. But there was just this tension in the Jewish world in the first century that, you know, this is our temple, but Herod built it. It's like, what do we do about this false fake king who happens to be Jewish, but is by no means a descendant of David's throne in either in his action or bloodline? You know, what do we even do about that? But man, you see the Temple Mount, and it's like what's funny is they have no clue really how it was built. There are stones on the Temple Mount that are the size of tour buses, like way bigger than school buses, and they came from quarries 5 or 6 miles away. They weighed like hundreds of tons, and they have no clue how they got there. And it's just like, that's, first of all, that's how Herod the Great and Herod Antipas built stuff, was they would blow modern people's minds and how they, you know. And another thing about the temple is they didn't, it was offensive to use chisels and hammers and stuff on site of the temple, because you don't want to be making, in a sense, making noise in God's house like that. Is not supposed to be a place where there's construction going on. If you're trying to be in the temple and pray to God, you don't want basically the sound of, you know, forklifts backing up behind you as you're trying to pray. So what they would do is they would shape it on site in quarry and then drag it 6 miles. They dragged it 6 miles. That didn't work. They dragged it 6 miles back to the quarry. They shaped it there and then drug it 6 miles back because they didn't want to use hammers and chisels and stuff on site. So it's a very beautiful building, and very unbelievably, just the way they built it is unbelievable. I think Alan made a really good connection, I think, of, because kind of what I've been thinking of is like the whole, how this is all one giant connected, I call it just why Jesus died. You know, why was Jesus put on trial at all? And so far from like 20 to now, it's all been just one big kind of, there's no non sequiturs is what I saw one author write. There's nothing that's out of place here. There's nothing that's like, that's just kind of thrown in for no reason, or this, Luke wanted to include one more argument between Jesus and the Sadducees. There's none of those in there. It is all connected. And I love the contrast you drew between the widow being poor and then them admiring the stones of the temple. Because how can you admire the stones of a temple that's been the reason this widow was poor? So Jesus then immediately snaps at them and says, why are you admiring these stones of this temple? And they start telling them on and on and on about how this temple is going to come crashing down because they didn't take care of the widow. And so it's there for exactly that reason, that contrast that was pointed out. So I'm glad we noticed that he says in the previous verses that you rob widows of their homes. And in the next verses is a widow who's poor and all she has to put in is 2 mites or whatever it's normally called. And it is great that we bring attention to her piety and that she was willing to put in 2 mites. But the point is that she shouldn't have had 2 mites to put in. She's like the widow with the robe story. She shouldn't have had to put a robe down for a loan. The point is she shouldn't have been that poor in the first place. And it's great that she was willing to offer that, but she shouldn't have been that poor in the first place. But then they have and we know from the Matthew and Mark that it's the disciples. At least that's what Matthew and Mark say. But then they have the audacity to say, wow, look at this great big temple that Herod built. It says, who cares what the temple looks like? It's filled with, well, what he calls later a den of thieves and a den of robbers. It's filled with priests who don't care for the poor and marginalized. And that is what's going to be the kind of this final pronouncement of judgment on the temple that ends in 21. And then they start plotting to kill Jesus. So I love that was pointed out, that these kind of all seem connected. And then what Alan said about, the 2 reasons you go into exile, which we'll look at in 21, the 2 reasons you go into exile are for idolatry and for not taking care of the poor and the marginalized. And that's what just happened with him addressing the idolatry. Should we pay tribute to Caesar? Should we give our allegiance? Should we give our worship to Caesar as Lord and God or not? So that's addressing idolatry. And then the next story, after a break on resurrection, the next story is addressing how they've cared for the poor. And they answered poorly to both those questions. And then he starts talking about the destruction of the temple. Which we'll see is an image for going into exile. But so yeah, that's what we're thinking about it.
Awesome. Anybody have any other thoughts, anything else to tie in here to this piece before we move into this next section where Jesus basically sets it up, describes it in broader brushstrokes, and then starts to get into some more specifics and then sums it up. And so it's kind of a fascinating outline. But anything else before we transition? Roy notes that in Upside Down Caring, we see the great plight of single mothers and widows, and it's often heartbreaking. And that's very true, Roy. It is. Even in our culture, how easy it is to overlook people or to be so enamored with the fill in the blank, whatever it is, shiny things, impressive things. And we put so much time and energy there that we just forget that the heart of the kingdom it's just be in the hands and feet of Jesus, and especially when it comes to the disenfranchised,
I think of it as almost, it's not a 1-to-1 correlation, but it's almost like we want to admire, look at this great, big, beautiful, and it's not a 1-to-1. The church building is not equivalent to the Jewish temple, but it's not equivalent. Look at this great, big, beautiful church. Look at all the people in here. Look at what they do. Look how they sing praises. But if you want to see God's attitude towards your church, it's quite literally, and this has been all throughout Luke, it's quite literally open up the church budget and let's see your attitude towards God. It is it is a 1-to-1 correlation with how do you spend your money? I'll tell you what you think about God. Doesn't matter how big your temple is, how big the stones, how beautiful it is. It is a scary thing that Israel can commit pretty severe sins. But what sends them into exile is lack of care for those who can't help themselves. And it's brutal.
Yeah, it's a great observation. David, I think you were going to make a comment.
Well, I remember as a young boy and in my days growing older that we used to pay more attention to the widow, to the poor. We they're poor, they need help. Well, they would receive clothes, they would receive money. The church, used to be more focused on the individuals. Now we all kind of go into a group deal, and the
Mhm.
people fall through the cracks. And I don't think that we're doing as good a job now as we used to do. That's just my observation. But
Yeah, and
I
that's
know there's lots of, oh well, there's lots of needy people. And I was with we I helped the oh the House of Hope. I
mhm,
was one of the ones that when we first started, I
mhm,
was there about 5 years, and I love that. But we're a group there. All right, the group has to come in,
right.
whereas the way it used to be, I knew the Thorpe family, I knew the Thornton family, I knew
Mhm.
this family, and they were needy, and you tried to help them. Everybody tried to help them with things, but I don't know. I just see it different now.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And sometimes, in church life, we have a tendency to think that by putting a group over here, by putting a group over there, that may be a good thing. And sometimes it can be successful, and sometimes it is not. And I just want us to I want us to dig deep into texts like this, not just for intellectual understanding of the nature of God, but my hope would be that these types of texts would move us to understand that when it comes to, as Tyler just said, where we put our time, where we put our monies. I'm pretty sure I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure those are the attitudes and the behaviors that elicit well done, good and faithful servant
Yes,
versus
yes.
what we built with our hands or whatever. And I mean that in a kind of a idolatrous sense, bowing down to the altar of material things. So Tyler, additional thoughts here, or whenever you're ready, you can transition. I'll turn it back over to you.
I was just thinking, I always get nervous about this stuff just because it's like Jesus walks into the temple and starts driving out the priest of the temple for not caring for the poor. And it is easy to criticize him because that's what the text is about. But the new kingdom of priests of the new temple is are Christian believers. So we're the priests of the temple. So God walks into, it's not that they messed up, it's that now we're the priest. He established a new temple, which we'll look at in this passage, that this one was going to be destroyed because the priesthood was so corrupt. The only solution was to destroy it and allow God to destroy it by hand of the Romans and set up his new temple in his name, a new kingdom of priests. And so it's like now it's our responsibility. We're priests in the temple. So I love looking at temples in the first century, not just, throughout the kind of ancient history of what different temples looked like. And it's fascinating to me because the amount of temples that you could walk in and they would give you free healthcare and free childcare and free money, and they would give you clothes, and they would do even anything. They would do anything for you because they just want you to give tribute to whatever god or goddess. It's fascinating to me. That was their representation of what that god was like. Athena wants you to have free childcare because she's the goddess of fertility. So she wants you to come in and have the ability to have as many children as you want, and the temple priestesses will help you with childcare during the day. Or the temples in the Greek world, you can walk in and they'll give you free healthcare because I forget the name of the Greek god that is the symbol for the medical symbol now, where the serpent around like
I think it's Asclepius, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
so that God wanted you to have free healthcare because they saw that, but all you had to do was give your allegiance to that God. You can't go into that temple without giving your allegiance. But once you do, it was all about free healthcare because they want you to see how powerful that God is. So people were, and that's why Jesus rebukes when he stitches together Jeremiah and Isaiah. He says, "My house was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations." Anyone was supposed to be able to come in here and see the God of Israel and see, in which the smallest temple in the world. If you see the Temple Mount is massive, but the actual temple itself is so tiny compared to other ones. It's like 100th of the size of other ones. It's unbelievably small comparatively to the other temples of Jesus' day, especially in the Greek world. But he says, "My house was supposed to be seen as a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves." So they were supposed to come in and see how great this God is, but you made them turn away from God and never want to see him. It's a scary thing once you know how temples kind of function in their world, and especially with that New Testament theology now of God. When people come into the presence of believers, they should see what God is like. It's like walking into the first century temple. They want to know what the God of Israel is like. It was supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, but they walk in, if 2 or 3 are gathered in his name and they see us, what do they think about God? Because now they're walking into the new temple. It's a scary. I love that stuff, but it's a scary thing, but it's also very fascinating. Did you want to get into the 21 stuff?
Whenever you're ready. Yeah.
Okay. A few things that I've kind of been going through in my head of, I wasn't here last week. If anyone's new, I wasn't here, so we didn't see each other, but I've been thinking a lot about Jesus' remarks on resurrection. So I don't know what you talked about, but I'll just give a few thoughts. So I'll go back quite a bit to last week. But I love that one is that passage is not a non sequitur, like it's not random. But I want you to see this whole reasoning Jesus died. Where are we at 20? We are in 21, yes, but I am going through 2027 through 40 right now. Just some thoughts because I wasn't here last week. I was responding to the chat. But that he goes straight from talking about giving tribute to Caesar or not. And we talked about giving tribute is giving your allegiance and proclaiming that Caesar is Lord and God. It's not paying taxes, but it's giving tribute to Caesar or not, giving tribute as Caesar being the God man. Is Caesar Lord and King? Do we give Caesar our allegiance or not? And he bleeds straight into that, to them challenging him. The Sadducees who deny that there is a resurrection, they start challenging him about the stipulations of the resurrection. And my first thoughts on that is I've run into this a lot recently of when a lot of times what happens is when we read resurrection, and by we I mean kind of modern church people now, when resurrection is thought of or read, we think of life after death, which is fascinating to me because it's exactly not what it's saying. It's not talking about going to heaven when you die. That is actually really not that talked about in scripture. This is one of the few places that where you go after you die is even talked about. That's actually quite a giant mystery. We know today you'll be with me in paradise, and that's pretty much it. to be away from the body is to be at home with the Lord. But Paul also says to be in the body is to be home. To be in the body is to be home, but to be at home with the Lord is to be home. So there's a lot of stuff I could just rant about Gnosticism, and kind of we have a functioning Gnosticism now where the body is bad and your soul is good, and you separate your soul from your body, and that's stuff that John 1 is specifically trying to rebuke. Actually, all of John really hates Gnosticism, but is specifically trying to attack of, it is not bad that Jesus was fleshly and bodily and became man. No, but I know just for that can freak people out, talking about resurrection being you die and you live immaterially with God until Jesus returns, and then you will be bodily resurrected and be given new bodies. And I say that to some of you that may be simple, but some people have been Christians the majority of their lives and don't know that. So I say that because I always want to never assume anything, and just start with you would be surprised how many people do not know that you will be raised in new bodies on the earth, and heaven is here on earth, and Jesus comes down to earth. The kingdom comes down to earth. Revelation 21, the new Jerusalem comes down to earth, and we will reign on the earth. We're not spirits floating around immaterially. That's Gnosticism. That's not Christianity. John could not stand the Gnostics. But we will be given new bodies free from the temptations and lust of the flesh. And we will never die and never be tempted again. But you'll be able to smell in heaven, and you'll be able to walk. And even now, Jesus being, I can't go into rant about, but I just love that stuff because that changes people's perception of heaven from being this distant, immaterial, floating in heaven, trying to be excited for some reason about floating around in free of space and time, and you try to convince yourself that sounds fun, and then you realize, and then when you read the biblical story, what you realize is no, we'll be resurrected and we'll all live together, much like now, but perfected and free from sin, and it's actually quite fun to look forward to and hopeful. But the Sadducees didn't believe that. And one of the things I've been learning so much recently is about the kind of the political, and Jesus Day, the political ramifications of resurrection, which sounds so silly, but let me explain. It's kind of like, one author said it as resurrection was one element of the total package deal, of the total freedom package deal. It was like God was going to deliver Israel from her bondage, and part of that was resurrection. And you see that in Ezekiel 37, that it wasn't just, the faithful Israelites, if they die, then they'll go with God. And then at some point they'll be resurrected. But it was when God delivers us and redeems us, we will be resurrected. And you see that in Ezekiel 37, the valley of the dry bones. And I love that passage because we love that passage because it mentions the Holy Spirit filling believers, which is true. But it also says in Ezekiel 37, it like shouts it at the end, this is the whole house of Israel. It's not talking about us right now. It says it's this image of a valley of dry bones Ezekiel is having. And it says that their strength is gone, their encouragement's gone, their hope is gone. He tells Ezekiel to prophesy to the dry bones, and the dry bones start becoming, they start having flesh and skin and, well, not bone, but flesh and skin, and they have life breathed into them and they're dwelt by the Spirit. And God tells them that this is the whole house of Israel. I'm bringing them back from exile. So being brought back from exile and resurrection are used as common and intertwined images. Think prodigal son. His son goes into a foreign pagan nation land, which is actually right across the Sea of Galilee, goes to the foreign pagan nation land, suffering the punishment for exile from Deuteronomy. And when he comes back, God says, my son, or the father says, my son was dead and now is alive. Resurrection and return from exile are the same thing. It's so the Sadducees don't judge. It's not just like they're, kind of agnostic and don't believe in life after death that we kind of just cease to live on, although they do, but they don't believe in a Messiah, and they don't believe in a Messiah because they don't believe in resurrection. They don't believe in resurrection because they don't believe in Messiah. They're a package deal. If a Messiah is going to come and raise us from the dead, which Jesus and Paul did not think of that. That was a Jewish belief long before Jesus and Paul. Jesus and Paul basically just take the Pharisaic belief and run with it because that's exactly what Paul teaches, is the Pharisaic belief of resurrection. But if the Messiah is going to come and do that, that also in that package deal, that includes resurrection, bodily resurrection. That includes the restoration of Israel in Jerusalem. That means the wiping out of the pagan invading army. So if the Sadducees are going to believe in that, they also have to believe the Romans are going to get wiped out, which they don't. And so, because if the Romans get wiped away by God, redeeming them and raising the dead, then they are no longer in a position of authority and power. So they don't believe in any of this stuff because they want to stay in their position of authority. It's not just that, we don't believe in that doctrine. It's no, we don't believe that there is coming future hope and redemption for Israel in that way. So that's why the Sadducees were effectively hand in hand with the Romans. So I hope you can see that context of, it's not like a non sequitur to, we're arguing about coins and paying taxes, and that seems political. And now we're arguing about this doctrine of resurrection. Now we're arguing about this, and we're just trying to find something we're trying to find something we can pin on Jesus so we can crucify him. In a sense, it is that they're trying to find something because they end up making up charges because they couldn't get him on anything. So they lie about the coin thing. But it's that he's giving them teaching on, he walks in and starts cleansing the temple like he's Judas Maccabee and like he's God and like he's the Davidic king come to rebuild the temple. So they say, so who do we give allegiance to then? Do you think you're God? Do you think you're priest? Do you think you're king? Do you think you're a new Maccabee? Do we give allegiance and tribute to you or Caesar? And he gives a masterful answer of yes and no, both and neither. It's an impossible answer. It frustrates me so much because he's answering a different question, but it's a question all about who do we give allegiance and tribute and our money to? Who do we say is Lord and God? Who do we say is the God man in charge, you or Caesar? And then they immediately ask, okay, so since you think you're in charge and we should or shouldn't give our tribute to Caesar or not, what about the resurrection? Let's challenge him on the resurrection. Do you think God's coming to restore and redeem Israel and redeem her from her political enemies? It's a deeply political passage. In Daniel 12, the same thing is talked about resurrection, and it's in the midst of talking about martyrdom and resisting foreign enemies and coming back from Babylon. And God, because when he resurrects you, he will bring you back and destroy the Babylonians behind you, just like Exodus, when he brings you out of Egypt, he will destroy the Egyptians in your wake. So Sadducees believe in that. Then they also have to believe that the people who are giving them all this power, the Romans, are also going to be destroyed, which they don't want to do. So then he immediately moves into this passage. So he challenges them. They didn't know what to do with his answer. He also quotes, he says the passage about the bush, which is Exodus 3. I'm sure y'all talked about, what about the passage about the bush? That's not just a rabbit trail. What about this passage? What do you say about this? What do you say about this? It's no, in the passage about the bush where God is speaking to Moses from the bush saying, I've heard the affliction and outcry of my people under the oppressive hand of the Egyptians. I am still God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, what about that passage? What do you do with that? And that passage is perfectly intertwined with the whole section on power and kingdom and politics and resurrection and oppressiveness and exile. It's perfectly intertwined. They don't know how to answer that. And then he goes into, how can the Messiah, how can they say the Messiah is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And I love that passage too, because it's not random, but that passage also was about this it's a weird passage because David says the Lord said to my Lord, and it's actually both the divine name of God. It's like, how can, it's almost like there's two different gods, and you, of course, that we know how that's fulfilled in Jesus. But it's this whole passage about the enemies of this person that David is talking about, having shared enemies with God, and then he ends up sitting on a throne with God and being enthroned, and he's given a scepter to rule. But he's also then made, and then God says, I will make you a priest forever. So this priest fights the enemies of God on his behalf and shares enemies with God, sits on his throne forever, and he'll be a priest after the order of Melchizedek or Melchizedek. It's fascinating because he's this priest king who becomes king by fighting God's enemies for him. But if he becomes priest, that means he supersedes any of the current priesthood, which the priests don't want to hear. So Jesus says, okay, what do you do about that passage then about how your job isn't going to last very long? And you don't like that passage very much, do you? And as a matter of fact, they didn't, because they actually just ignored the rest of the Bible after Deuteronomy because they didn't agree with it, because it all said that if they don't shepherd well, God's going to destroy them. So Jesus, I love that Jesus then takes us another deeply political passage, and even political in our sense doesn't capture what it's doing because it's all intertwined. It's religion and politics and ethnicity, and it's all the same thing to them. So it's, okay, what about David saying, how is the son of David, is the Messiah in authority because he's David's son or because he's David's Lord? And the answer is both. He's king because he's David's son, and he's in charge because he's David's Lord, because he's the God-man, which we would say. But they just don't know. They don't know how to answer him. So then the disciples start, kind of adoring the stones of the temple. Sorry, 1 second. But first thing is, so then he gets them on the charges of not caring for the poor, which is exactly in line. It's not a non sequitur. It's okay. Your time is running short. The Melchizedek priest king is coming, and he's going to supersede any priesthood that you have, because as we see from evidence, they don't take care of the poor. So they start adoring the temple, and then he starts kind of going on this little lecture about not a little lecture, but lecture about the temple being destroyed. He says, so as for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left one stone upon another, another that will not be thrown down. And they asked him, teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign that these things are about to take place? So they say, well, we want to know when and where. And he gives them a very long answer to a when and where. He said, see that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Do not go after them. And when you hear of wars and tumults, do not be terrified, for these must first take place, but the end will not be at once. Meaning the end is not just this, and he's not talking about second coming end. He's not talking, very importantly, he's not talking about the end of space and time. That is not, when we talk about the return of Jesus or the eschatology, the end times, that's not talking about the end of time itself, or the end of time and space, and then the universe collapsing into nothing, and then we live in some different realm with God. That's not at all what it's talking about. But talking about the final historical things to take place before the new creation happens. So that's pretty important to know, I think, that the end of this is not that time and space itself ceases to exist. But he starts explaining to him, it won't be at once. So let me explain what happens. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines and pestilences, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. It's exactly what happened to Paul. And you will be brought before the kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it therefore in your minds, not to meditate beforehand how to answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of them will put you to death. You will be hated for all by my name's sake, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you will know that its desolation has come near. Desolation is a huge word there, straight from Daniel. We'll get into. Know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea, that's where Jerusalem is, flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, the Romans, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So they want to know, when is the destruction of the temple, and how's it going to take place? So he tells them. He's not answering a different question. He's telling them how it's going to take place. So he starts going into basically first what's going to happen to you, and then what will happen to Jerusalem. The setting is very important. he is on the Mount of Olives, as we'll see from the other synoptics, but also at the end of this, it says they were staying at the Mount of Olives and they left the Mount of Olives and all that. So they're at the Mount of Olives, which is not insignificant, which I find interesting because that very popular, there's a funny, oh, actually hanging on a wall, so I can't say anything, but there's that very famous picture taken from the east looking west of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, and you can see the Dome of the Rock and all that. That's the mountain that's taken on the Mount of Olives. And I find that fascinating because we love that view of Jerusalem, but first that's the view that made Jesus weep bitterly over Jerusalem. He got to the top of the Mount of Olives, saw the city, and then wept over it because of its desecration, because it didn't understand the kingdom. And then right now, this is the image they would have seen. They would have looked at the glory of Jerusalem and says, wow, it's so beautiful. And then he goes on this long rant about why do you think this is beautiful? Because it's completely desecrated and desolate and it's going to be destroyed. So I think it's funny we have a picture of it. But so they're admiring how big these stones are from the Mount of Olives. And Mount of Olives in Zechariah 14 is huge for this theme over and over we've been talking about: the return from exile, the vindication of God's people, the saving of God's people, their atonement, all that stuff. And Zechariah 14, we won't go through, is that same idea that it says the Lord himself will stand on the Mount of Olives and he will see it split open and the dead will raise and he will save the city. It's all this imagery of return from exile, of resurrection, of God becoming king, of standing on the Mount of Olives. It's all these themes kind of replayed over and over. And Jesus says, many will come in my name, which we know historically they did. Many people came in Jesus' name. There's already like 10 people that came claiming to be Messiah before Jesus ever did. So it's not that we should be looking out every day for people claiming to be Messiah, because that he's very clearly talking about 70 AD, because he says Jerusalem like 5 times. So he's not talking about now, he's talking about 70 AD. Luke very much splits up the near far of the near far prophecy of, because in a sense, the destruction of Jerusalem is a type of the future tribulation coming on the world, but Luke very much separates these. And I think this is all about destruction of Jerusalem. And chapters back, he already talked about kind of the second coming of Christ and the return of the Son of Man. So he gives a bunch of images, like fleeing with young children from Hosea 13, running to the mountains. That's common day of the Lord language from Ezekiel 7 and from Isaiah. When Babylon's being destroyed, you flee to the mountains. That's what you do. So those are all pretty, I don't want to go through those because there's a lot of little references, but that is because it's not those specific verses, you can go through them, but what you need to see is that common theme and image of day of the Lord happening. And when the day of the Lord happens, what it says is the moon will be darkened, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will turn red or something, and there will be no light, and it'll be cold, and it'll be dark, and it'll be hot or something, or then the enemy nation that's oppressing God's people will be destroyed. And then when that happens, flee to the mountains, and that happens over and over and over with all the exiles that happens. And it's the same thing with Exodus too, but it happens with Babylon. It's the same imagery being applied, but if you see now, it's that imagery is not being applied now to Rome, but it's being applied to the temple. They look at the temple and say, oh, it's so beautiful. And he says, well, don't think that it's beautiful because it's going to be destroyed. And he starts giving them the judgment from God language towards Babylon, but it's not towards Babylon. It's not towards Rome. It's towards the temple. It's towards Jerusalem. Jerusalem's become the new Babylon. The temple's become the new Babylon. So you're being saved not from Rome, but you're being saved from, in a sense, yourselves. You're being saved from the temple itself. The temple's so corrupt and so oppressive that the only solution is to destroy it. And when that day happens, the sun will be dark and the moon will be dark and the stars will fall, from Isaiah, from Ezekiel, from Joel. You can probably just Google it. So when I like this quote I saw in a book, it says, when God acts to judge the Babylons of this world, darkness and cosmic darkness is the dominant image, and fleeing is a common theme when God judges the Babylons of this world, no matter who it is. So there'll become a time when they see, Jerusalem occupied by enemy forces. And when you see that, flee for the hills. When you see Jerusalem occupied by Rome, and it says when you see the abomination or the desolation, Matthew makes it a little bit more clear. He says the abomination of desolation, quote, let the reader understand, which I like, so helpful, because he's trying to say the most anti-Roman thing he can without tipping off the Romans. So he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, let the reader understand what that means. Use your context clues to understand. It's very clearly talking about Rome. When you see that, flee for the hills. And Luke just put the desolation. What the abomination of desolation is when Gentile pagans come into the temple, they clear out the temple, they kill all the priests and stuff, and then they start doing pagan practices in God's temple. They start sacrificing pigs. When Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid ruler in the Maccabean lesson we did, they saw that in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. That was the abomination of desolation. And I think Jesus is talking about another one. When you see the Roman emperor sacrificing pigs in God's temple here and within a generation. Start running. Don't try to fight. That's not what the kingdom of God's about. Don't fight, but start running. Run to the hills, because when you see these things, your redemption is drawing near. It's very fascinating language. So that, I think, is one of the most important things about this whole thing, is that Son of Man language. And this is where I would probably disagree with a lot of people. But it's because I think we get the Son of Man language. I don't know if I would disagree with that view, but disagree with the idea that we get the Son of Man language backwards. Because the Son of Man, you have to just go through Daniel 7 a few times. You get this image of the beast of the world. It's this amalgamation of all the pagan empires of the world. And then you get the Son of Man fighting them and defeating them. And he is exalted. He comes up by the clouds to sit on a throne by the Ancient of Days, and all people and pray. People worship him of all nations, tongues, and tribes, and people everywhere worship this Ancient of Days and this Son of Man. And he's given authority. He's giving a kingdom that never fades. So when Jesus says the coming of the Son of Man, who is he coming to? That word is actually very unclear. Is he coming or going? It could be either, because where's he coming from? Where's he going to? And it's not, I don't think Jesus' point is when you see the coming of the Son of Man coming back to you on a cloud from heaven, whether or not that will happen, there's debate. I don't know if he meant a literal cloud. He didn't come in a literal cloud the first time. He didn't come if you read through Isaiah, how the Messiah would arrive, it doesn't seem to match up with how the birth of Jesus matched up. But that's for First and Second Thessalonians. But when he says, when you see the Son of Man, when you see the temple destroyed, basically, when you see the temple occupied by the Romans, when you see the temple destroyed, you raise up your head, for your redemption is drawing near, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Because you saw the temple destroyed, you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. People historically saw this as Jesus predicting the end of the world within a generation, which is fair. That seems like what he's saying, that when you see the destruction of the temple, Jesus will come back, unless the coming of the Son of Man is the exact same coming of the Son of Man from Daniel 7. And the coming of the Son of Man is him coming to the Ancient of Days. And so basically what's happening here is Jesus is staking his whole ministry, his whole kingdom, his whole reputation on this statement. The temple will be destroyed within a generation. And when it does, when it's occupied by the Romans, when they start sacrificing pigs in the temple, you run from the hills of Judea and you know that I was right. That's what he's saying. And raise up your head for when you see that day. Although it's a great and miserable day, lift up your head, your redemption is drawing near. I was right. I am the Son of Man seated on the throne beside the Ancient of Days. Not that I'm going to return soon. Look out for me. No, it's when you see the temple destroyed, know everything I said was true and right. And heaven and earth will pass away before my prophetic judgment passes away. It's a staking his whole life on this prophetic statement that the temple will be destroyed within a generation. And when it does, you'll know that I was the Son of Man and I am by the Ancient of Days. So it's because it does seem like Jesus is saying, I'm coming back soon. And when the temple's destroyed, then you'll know it'll be soon. But then it's been 2,000 years. So it's like, okay, well, what do we do? Because it very clearly wasn't soon. So then he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. That's Isaiah, language from Isaiah. He's not saying heaven and earth will pass away. I know it says that, but he's not saying that because it's prophetic. It's from Isaiah. It's the same thing as the flowers of the field will perish, the grass will wither, but the word of the Lord stands forever. He's not talking about the grass will be removed from the earth. He's saying, it is more likely that heaven itself will pass away than what I said will come untrue. It's a prophetic stamp to say what I said it will be true and it will happen. So it's kind of flipped, and the image he gives them for watching out for it is the fig tree. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. He can't be talking about second coming or else he's wrong. He said, this generation won't pass away until everything I just said happened. So that's kind of the line is everything will happen. What I just said before this generation, which is 40 years, which he was right. It was 70 AD that was destroyed before all these things take place. But he says the way to look at it is the way you look at a fig tree and know that the leaves come out, that summer is near. Know that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And what he's not saying is look to the constellations and the blood moons and all this stuff and the prophetic book and try to predict what day or hour Jesus is coming back. He very clearly said you don't know the day or hour, and even in the flesh, Jesus did not know the day or hour. Only the Father. So I don't know why people try to find out something that Jesus himself didn't know. That seems like it. God's pretty good at keeping secrets. It's not hard for him to keep a secret. He says, but watch yourselves, lest your heart be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the cares of life. And that day come upon you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all who dwell in the whole earth. So now we get this near far thing. That was all Jerusalem. That was all 70 AD. And that is a pretty common scholarly opinion of Luke, because Luke divides it so much. This will happen before 70 AD. I put my life on it. I put my ministry on it. I will be known that I was the Son of Man that came to the Ancient of Days when the temple is destroyed. And I put my stamp on that. That is true. Heaven and earth will pass away before that passes away. And then he shifts to the future. He shifts to what we call second coming, or the future tribulation, or whatever what you would call it. It says, but watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life. And that day will come upon you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and stand before the Son of Man. And every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went to lodge at the Mount Olivet. So then he shifts to kind of, what do we do now? As we're waiting Jesus to return, what is our attitude? And I love Jesus' teachings on what's called eschatology, study of the end things. His attitude towards eschatology is usually not our attitude towards it, because you read through the stuff and maybe you get freaked out. You see the sun, the moon, the stars, and the earthquakes, and the famine, and the armies. And first of all, that's just an average day in human life, which I always find that funny, that it's like, a battle breaks out somewhere and we're like, oh, Jesus is coming back soon. I was like, just read a history book from the year 33 AD to 2021 AD. It's like, that's just like Wednesday in human existence is sickness and famine and pestilence and war and rebellion and military coups. And that was literally daily life in first century. And that's daily life now. Now, when it happens to us in the US, it can seem life-changing because we feel so safe and protected here. But, in some parts of the world, it's Wednesday, so there's going to be a coup. It's just like, that's kind of how life goes. But our attitude can be really negative towards, I understand there's kind of crazies that try to predict the end of the world or predict when Jesus will come back, or, look at the constellations and count and all that crap, which is a bunch of nonsense. Okay. Jesus said, don't try to know the day or hour. But he says, look at the seasons. He says, look at the world around you and know that this is the final hour. And Paul tells us over and over, this is the final hour. We're almost done. He says that to encourage you, not to scare you. You shouldn't be scared. This is the final hour. So raise your head. Your redemption is drawing near. Get ready and get excited about Jesus coming back. It's not get scared about Jesus coming. I love, one professor I had says, is it really scary? And when we think about the return and the second coming of Christ, is it really scary colors like reds and blacks and dark oranges, or is it pastels? Is it like light pastel colors and happy and joyful and redemptive? And I was like, that's a good way to think about it. It's redemptive and happy colors. If that works for you, I don't know. It worked for me. But his attitude towards looking toward the second coming is hopefulness, and it's sobriety. It's pay attention, stay awake, keep your worldview in check. He's like, pay attention to what's going on around you. It's like, first of all, I think 2020, I know all the complaining that many people have done, but I think it was a fascinating year. I'm not saying it was good or was comfortable, but quite literally it was opposite, which I think could be good. The fact that it was uncomfortable, maybe that'll kind of kick people out of their dissipation and drunkenness. That'll kick them out of this kind of just stuck in fifth gear kind of in life, as you're kind of just cruising along. And then, something comes around and kind of kicks our worldview back in shape. So I love that. I have appreciated 2020 greatly. Thankfully, nothing too tragic has happened to us, but it's like, this is really pushing us against the wall and making kind of wake up a bit to the drunkenness that can kind of come with daily life. And I can lecture about that, but I think we're out of time. Yeah, we are out of time. So I will stop there. If you got anything, Greg.
And we got a couple of minutes in case anybody would like to ask a question or make an observation. It was a lot of information, incredible. Thank you so much, Tyler, for sharing all of that. This was recorded tonight, and so I will try my best to get this posted on YouTube quickly so that you can go back and review again. We're getting fairly close to hitting the home stretch of our study, and so a few more weeks. We'll look forward to reconnecting next Wednesday night, if not before. And so anything else before we wrap up? All right, fantastic. Thanks. Thanks so much, everybody. Hope you all have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you Sunday, if not before. Take care.